Welcome to CCG 7th edition of Annual China and Globalization Forum. You're watching the forum's special program, The Future of the Multilateral Trading System in Changing Global Context, presented to you by the Center for China and Globalization. This dialogue is hosted by CCG President Dr. Wang Huiyao. Dr. Wang, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening and good morning and also good afternoon. Depends where you are. And we have our guests, one in US, one in Europe. And so thank you for tuning in for our audience here in China and also in other parts of the world. You are watching CCG Special Dialogue, which is the multilateral trading system in global changing context, live from CCG head office. This is actually a part of a 7th annual China and Globalization Forum. And this year, CCG took the initiative to organize the discussion on the recovery of the global economy, trade and mobility, China-EU economic cooperation, global cooperation, and the China New Development Plan, and also China's international communication. And also we had quite a bit of focus on the China-US relations on the webinar and also on the multilateral trading system. So tonight, this forum is really devoted to the multilateral trading system, but also globalization. So this forum actually achieved a great success. As a matter of fact, we have more than 400 distinguished guests taking part, including nearly 30 ambassadors and over 50 senior diplomats, country heads of international trade groups and the chambers and the multinationals, represented from international organizations, non-profit and the government representatives, and also business leaders, scholars, and experts from academic and think tank community. So it's quite a annual forum that CCG organized. We're very pleased to organize this concluding webinar, which is one of the very important webinar tonight. So we already had 2 webinars in the previous 2 days. The first online webinar we had was John Thornton. He's the chair emeritus of book institutions and co-chair of Asia Society. And he is also Adam Posen, president of Peterson Institute, and also Ambassador Steve Roy, the former US ambassador to China, and also CCG advisor, the former Vice Minister Zhu Guangyao attended our first Sino-US webinar. And then yesterday we had a second webinar, which is focused on also China-US relation. We had the former acting Deputy Secretary of the State Department for Asia, Ms. Susan Thornton, but also with the Ronnie Chen, the chair of Asia Society Hong Kong Center. So we are very pleased actually as our final webinar tonight. We have actually thrilled to have 2 distinguished guests to explore the global trade and globalization with us. So we have an honor to have invited Pascal Lamy and Wendy Cutler, also a good friend. I'd like to introduce Pascal Lamy. Pascal Lamy is the president of the Paris Peace Forum, which is a very well-known, well-established peace forum in Paris. It's running for, it's getting its 4th year now. And he's also a coordinator of a Jacques Delors think tank, which include Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. He was the longest serving WTO Director General so far in the history of WTO, from 2005 to 2013. And between 1999 and 2004, he was the EU Trade Commissioner. And also, he began his career in the French civil service at Inspection General, the finance, and also the treasury. Then he became an advisor to the finance minister, Jacques Delors, and subsequently to Prime Minister Pierre Mauroy. He served as a chief of staff to the EU president, Jacques Delors, between 1984 and 1999. So thank you, welcome, Pascal. Pascal also come to CCG Beijing office quite a few times, and I remember as early as 2019, you presented a speech at CCG on WTO reform and the multilateral trading system, and many CCG colleagues and experts from this field from China attended. And last year, you were also spoke at the CCG 6th Annual Forum on China and Globalization, and also gave a very good congratulatory remarks for the CCG Global Young Leaders Dialogue, which launched in last December. I would like also to introduce another well-known speaker tonight. Ms. Wendy Carter is Vice President at Asia Society Policy Institute, and also the Managing Director of its Asia Society in Washington, DC office. And also in her role, she focused on building SB's presence in the national's capital on leading initiatives that address challenges related to trade, investment, and innovation, as well as women's empowerment as well in Asia. She joined SB following an impressive career of nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and a negotiator in office of U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, where she also served as an acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative. During her USTR career, she worked on a range of bilateral, regional, and multilateral trading negotiations and initiatives, including the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership TPP, U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial service negotiations. She has published a series of SB papers on Asian trade and also many other global multilateral trading issues. I also remember hosting Wendy, actually, when you come to CG in January 2018, which is quite a few years ago. And when CCG and SB jointly hosted the U.S.-China Economic Relations Roundtable at that time. But also, again, later that year, we actually had joined your breakfast meeting at the Washington hosted by SB, and we had a very good discussion between our 2 think tanks. I remember the meeting you hosted in Washington. We had many well-known U.S. experts, including the Catherine Chai, now the USTR, who also attended the CCG and the SB event in DC. So it's also, worth mentioning that back April last year, both Wendy and Lamy participated in the CCG webinar, the role of a WTO in global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot has actually happened and a lot has changed then. So let's begin our discussion today. And so maybe I'll start with Wendy. I mean, since you are very familiar with the US government and you were former US government officials, particularly you looked after WTO and the multilateral trading system for quite a long time. So what are the US priorities for the WTO reform and also the actually upcoming 12th Ministerial Conference? Perhaps you could start, and then we have Pascal to start us again.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really my honor to be here at another CCG forum, unfortunately virtual. I look forward to doing these in person again. And it's really, I'm humbled to share the virtual stage with Pascal and me, who has so much experience and expertise in this area, as well as you, Dr. Wang. So I'm looking forward to a very robust discussion. I thought before I talk a little about how I think the Biden administration is viewing WTO reform, is first just to highlight kind of 3 cornerstones of the Biden administration trade policy, because I think that will help us understand their view on the multilateral approach, as well as on the upcoming WTO ministerial. First, the Biden administration trade policy is very integrated with its domestic agenda. And so issues like COVID recovery, climate change, Build Back Better, all of these initiatives which are being pursued on a domestic basis are also being pursued on an international basis. Second, when it comes to trade policy, the new phrase in Washington is a worker-centric trade policy. I get a lot of questions on what that actually means. So let me share my sense with you, but I would be the first to admit, I think it's a work in progress, and that how this policy kind of translates into concrete trade initiatives is still being developed. But what the basis for this policy is really rethinking US trade policy as one that needs to change in order to benefit the working class, the middle class, be responsive to their concerns and priorities, and use trade to really improve not only the number of jobs for US workers, but also to improve the quality of jobs. And again, not just US workers, but workers around the world. And to really use trade, the phrase that Ambassador Tai uses a lot is use trade as a force of good to really uplift the situation and livelihood of workers, as well as to promote more equality among workers, the middle class, et cetera. And the third kind of pillar of the Biden trade policy is to work with allies and partners. We just launched, for example, a Trade and Technology Council with the European Union, which for the purposes of today's discussion includes a working group on global trade challenges. But it also is centered on really being constructive and being engaged in international organizations, multilateral institutions, including the WTO. And so I think all three of these kind of pillars are relevant to today's discussion. And when it comes to the WTO, we did see some early moves by the Biden administration to really show that they're back in the WTO, including very quick endorsement of the new Director General, not even waiting for the confirmation of Ambassador Tai. But now we have a new Director General at the helm. I'm sure we'll be talking more about Dr. Ngozi. Second, the United States has been very constructively engaged in the WTO agenda. Just last week, for example, we joined the Services Domestic Regulation plurilateral talks. We have been active members of the fish subsidies negotiations. And of course, we are joined ranks with others in calling for a TRIPS waiver for COVID purposes. So I think that gives some indication of how engaged and committed we are. Now, that said, we still have not nominated nor confirmed an ambassador to Geneva, to the WTO. And a lot of our, let's just say, kind of statements on WTO reform have yet to be translated into actual proposals that we've put on the table. But I think that will happen in time. But I also think it's important that when we think about WTO reform and we think about the upcoming ministerial, this can't just be about the United States and what the United States is going to do. And are we conformed? And are we committed? And are we putting proposals on the table? In order for the WTO to move forward and for the ministerial to be successful, this is going to require contributions from all 164 members, as well as the major countries, major trading countries, including the Europe, China, and the United States. And with respect to China, I think that it's going to be important for China to kind of step up here and help move the WTO forward and update its rules. And in particular, I want to highlight the agenda in the WTO with respect to non-market economies. And I think this is an area looking forward where we will need to find a way to work together if the WTO is going to continue to be relevant. And I think there'll be a lot of interest in this agenda as we get closer to the 20th anniversary of China's accession to the WTO, which will take place later this year. Now, I know I've been talking for a long time. Let me just make a few comments then on the MC12, the ministerial conference coming up starting November 30th in Geneva. This will be the first ministerial, if I'm correct, for the WTO in 4 years. It will be the first ministerial that will be led by the new Director General Ngozi. And it's going to be a challenge given where we are with COVID now, particularly if in-person meetings cannot take place in the lead up to the ministerial, and if the ministerial is not an in-person event or a hybrid event. Because I think, as we all know, for concrete outcomes to come out of WTO meetings, in-person meetings, side conversations, talks between smaller groups of countries are really essential. And no matter how great our virtual platforms are, they are limited with respect to in my view, to be able to really negotiate the final issues which allow actual successful negotiations to reach their conclusion. The United States has been, I think, very cautious yet realistic about its objectives for the ministerial meeting. I think partially taking into account where we are with COVID now and the possibility of in-person meetings. But I also think it's important that we don't set high expectations and then don't meet them. I think it's not in the WTO's interest for any headline around this ministerial to use the word fail or not to have lived up to where it needs to be. And so I think that's why the United States has kind of put forward what it calls a targeted approach, calling for a successful conclusion to the fishery subsidies negotiations, but also calling for some kind of modest institutional reforms with respect to transparency, to dealing with the self-declaration LDC issue, developing country issue, and other institutional reforms. So let me stop there. I think there's a lot more to talk about, but hopefully I've touched some of the issues that will be subject to our conversation this evening.
Okay, great. Thanks, Wendy. I think you have highlighted, of course, the importance of WTO. I think that I'm very glad to see that Biden administration is now back to WTO, which you have illustrated, and also a quick approval of DJ since Biden took office. And also we see the DJ has also appointed 4 deputy DJ, and then we have one from US, one from China, one from EU, and so it's quite well represented now. I agree that we should really focus on the future of the WTO, because I think this pandemic is really we need a world trade to reboot the global economy, particularly given the history, in previous time, the Second World War, all those financial crises. We need always international trade has been a big boost to the stability and global economic growth. So Pascal, you are the guru on WTO. You are the longest serving WTO DJ, and he knows EU, China, and EU also a strong supporter of the multilateral system. I mean, US, as Trump has backed off for a while. Hopefully now Biden is coming again, but EU has been always there. China is also a strong supporter of the multilateral system now also. So what's your assessment? I mean, also, can all the major players play some more roles to shape the revival of the WTO to gain the confidence? I mean, after Doha round, we haven't really achieved anything. So what's your take on this? I mean, your opinion obviously is widely watched, and also that impact on the globalization and also recovery of global economy.
Okay, I'll try to answer your question, Henry, and let me also thank you for inviting me together with Wendy for this conversation. Short term, I think the main issue for us all remains to exit this pandemic, sanitary-wise, economy-wise, policy-wise, and this is not mostly a trade issue, although open trade and boosting trade can help a lot to boost the necessary recovery. There are a few issues that have to do with vaccine production, intellectual property, vaccine distribution, but this is not central to the multilateral trading system. If we look back at the sort of a big cockpit view, why do we need a multilateral trading system? Why do we need a World Trade Organization? Basically, to reduce obstacle to trade. Insofar as we believe, and a lot of us believe this, that opening trade is a good thing overall, hence reducing obstacle to trade that prevent trade to be more open is what needs to be done generally. Now, this is the big principle which necessitates immediately a bit of a qualification, which is why I totally agree with what Wendy said about the US trade policy or the EU trade policy or the China trade policy being very much a domestic issue. And the reason why it is a domestic issue is that if opening trade works overall to create efficiencies, if the sum of wins and losers is positive globally because efficiencies are higher, hence growth higher, this is usually not true locally. And the question of what is the real impact in a country of trade opening on profession X, worker Y, consumer Z is something which is much more complex than the big picture. In other words, while opening trade is a global issue and hence necessitates a multilateral trading system, a lot of attention has to be taken locally in how you manage the distribution between winners and losers. Winners can be much more many than losers globally, but this may not be true locally. And the reality is that in the West, there has been, for the last 10 or 15 years, more debate about whether or not this winner-loser equation has been taken right. And this explains why trade policy is very much a domestic policy. I remember when I was DG of WTO asking a minister if she could do this or that, and the answer was, come on, you're asking me to negotiate with myself. And my answer was precisely, this is exactly what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to renegotiate with your own constituency, your mandate, so that you can move. So that's for the sort of general introduction. The reality is that we have a relatively open world trading system that has worked for the last decades. Trade is more open today than it was 10 years ago, and 10 years ago it was more open than 20 years ago, yet there remains a number of issues in terms of leveling the playing field, i.e. ensuring as much as possible a fair competition between producers so that the benefits of trade opening of competition can flow to the benefit of consumers. There are basically, in my view, now in the world of today, which is quite different from the world of yesterday, two major issues on the substance of what needs to be done multilaterally to level the playing field. One has to do with competition, and another has to do with how you handle precaution. competition is about ensuring that producers compete on a fair ground, i.e., without trade distortions, which classically are quantitative restrictions, tariffs, and subsidies. Quantitative restrictions and tariffs are, in today's world, not a major issue. They've been dealt with in the past, whereas subsidies, and notably because of where China is in the world economy, remain a problem. And I think the main issue for the multilateral trading system and for the WTO, as far as leveling the playing field is concerned, is what the Chinese leadership calls competitive neutrality. The reality is that China is a different economic political organization than the rest of the world, which is organized around globally liberal market capitalism. The reality is that China remains a communist country whose view is that holding 30% of the production system in the hands of the party, of the state, is the right way to go. This is very different from the rest of the world, and it's probably more different now, at least for the last 10 years, than it had been in the 10 previous years after China joined the World Trade Organization. So competitive neutrality, how to ensure that competing on the Chinese domestic market and on the international market with state-owned enterprises who are state-owned because they need the state support to what the Chinese leadership attributes to the benefits of this vast state-owned sector is an issue which, of course, many other countries have now to deal with. EU, US are probably more outspoken than others in the fact that they see this problem with competing with state-owned enterprises as an issue, and then that necessitates further adjustment of the rules of WTO as far as subsidization is concerned. But there are many other countries that have the same view. So as far as the purpose of organizing a level playing field fair system is concerned, I think the issue number one is to strengthen WTO rules on state aid. This is not the only issue. Another one, which is more recent, has to do with what I call precaution. Precaution is when you protect your people from risks, whereas protection is when you protect your producers from foreign competition. Precaution is now raising. It's about environment, it's about health, it's about safety, it's about security, it's about privacy. And this leads to a more fragmented, a more important part of regulation in the economy, and a regulation that is more fragmented, given that the way you protect your people from risks is very often correlated with ideology, with culture, with religion, with history. And this is, I think, a major issue for the future. So this is what I see as the two main issues. Plus, and I'll finish this introduction to our discussion with an issue which is quite dear to my heart, which unfortunately, in my view, does not get the level of attention which it should from countries' negotiations and trade negotiators, which is the WTO itself as a process. I think the way the organization works needs a lot more attention, needs a lot of reform, because contrary to less a priori modern organization, the WTO as a machinery to legislate regulate globally is not what it should be for a number of reasons, which I think needs to be addressed. I won't expand on that, but I deeply believe that the machine room needs attention if we want the WTO to be able to be up to its task in the future. Over to you, Henry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pascal. Yeah, I think both you and Wendy has actually, outlined your perspective on the WTO reform, and of course also you mentioned about the future, roles and the shaping the WTO. So, but also mentioned about China as well. I think that China actually, we just had recently, about last month, we organized the event, discussion about China joining the WTO for the 20th anniversary. We had a formal China WTO chief negotiator, Minister Long Yong-tu, and also we had former Vice Minister, the DDJ of WTO, Minister Yi Xiaozhen. Many other experts came and to CCG talked about that. What I think actually, for the WTO, which are, of course, trade has been greatly benefit China, but also the world. Like China, since China joined WTO, China's export to the world has increased 7 times, but China's buy-in to the world has increased 6 times also, and even more so on the service trade. So I think it's really multi-party win situation, whereas China's trade with developing countries has increased hugely, but also that China has contributed to 1/3 of the global GDP growth now. So I think the system, I agree with both of you said, this reform, this policy, it's also related with its domestic policy as well. China has been, lifted 800 million people out of poverty and representing 70% of the cutting of the global poverty, 10 years ahead of the SDG agenda on poverty alleviation. So it shows that, the system probably in China also works for itself. Like Pascal mentioned about there's a SOE portion of that, but for any disaster relief, for lifting poverty and all those, the SOE has to be in the front and has to deliver many social responsibilities. So I think, this hybrid system that China has seems working for itself. But of course, I think you raised a very good point about competitive neutrality. I think that is also a concept that is being widely discussed in China as well. I think there could be room for the future improvement. Absolutely. I think that also, as Wendy knows well, that China also shows a great desire to join CPTPP now, which in that, Minister of Commerce has put forward the CPTPP agreement on Ministry website. Here's the objective. Here's the standards that we need to look forward in the future. And then that's, I'm sure, Wendy, you helped to design many of that as well. So I think this is really a great discussion that we're having here. But what I want to raise another question is that I remember last year when we had this CCG webinar on multilateral trading system reform. Both you attended, and also including Alan Wolf, the then Deputy Director General of WTO, and quite a few other experts from China. We mentioned about WTO reform. There's a lack of leadership, and last year was really very obvious lack of leadership. But I think EU, China, but now US is back. And since WTO everything is on consensus, we need really strong leadership. So can really China, EU, and US, of course, to take really a great concerted efforts to really make WTO work. I mean, Wendy, you have written recently saying that maybe we could have a US, EU, China forum on the multilateral trade system. I think that is a great idea to pursue. But also, last time when we were discussing that, we were talking maybe Secretary Office of WTO should play more role, like a WHO or many other organizations, where I think where member state probably is too many and too many roles that hard to make a decision. And also thirdly, we really need some low-hanging fruit to conclude. like this fishery subsidy discussion has been going on for so long. Maybe it's high time we conclude on that. But also, some of those low-hanging fruit, like plastic emission to the ocean, that WTO can do something. I remember I went to the WTO Public Reform in 2019. I gave a talk there on this initiative. I think both EU and Chinese WTO ambassadors were there, very supportive, and many other countries too. So maybe, but also, digital economy, other, labor, trade, investment, facilitation, liberalization of the investment. So those new things I think we could probably push forward. So I don't know, Randy, maybe we can have a more further discussion on those issues that you can give your opinion as well. Randy, please.
Well, thank you. Maybe before I get your question, just a couple of comments. I mean, I couldn't agree more with Pascal and me that we really need to look at the WTO machinery and these institutional issues, because they're so interrelated with the inability of the WTO to produce successful negotiating outcomes. And so, the approach that the WTO followed, for its early years with respect to needing consensus to arrive at decisions, to focus on this MFN principle that all benefits from a negotiation should be applicable to all members, and the issue of, frankly, LDC self-selection. I think all three of these issues are perhaps outdated now, and they seriously need to be looked at. And, Henry, you mentioned the fish subsidies negotiation. Well, one of the major stumbling blocks in that negotiation, frankly, from the US perspective, at least, and I think Europe and others, is this whole issue of developing countries, including China, wanting to be treated as developing countries and therefore not assume, full obligations. And so I just wanted to make the link between these institutional issues, which sound very kind of wonky. They're so interrelated with where we see the WTO today. So I think it's important that we look at these issues. And in my view, I think the only way forward is to allow for subsets of WTO members to meet, to negotiate, to agree on outcomes, to share the benefits just among those parties, but at the same time to invite other parties to join and to offer them the technical assistance that might be needed to get them to be in a place where they can participate. So I wanted to make that point. The second point, Henry, you mentioned a bit about China's accession to the WTO. I am a firm believer that that was the right decision for the United States at that time to be a supporter of WTO accession. And when I look at the important legal and regulatory changes that China made at that time, how it opened and reformed its economy, how it became, as you mentioned, kind of a global trade force, and it's brought benefits to the international trading environment. I don't disagree with any of that, but I also think now when we, here we are in 2021, changes need to be made, updates need to be made if indeed this system can be credible and can continue to function as a major force in the WTO rule-making process. When China joined the WTO, I don't think there was any expectation that there wouldn't be updates to the WTO rules. In fact, there was a new round that was launched at that time under the leadership of Pascal and me. And I think the expectation was that rules would be updated, there'd be new market access commitments, we would continue to update the subsidies rules or introduce rules on state-owned enterprises. But we all know the history, none of that's happened. So here we are, and the status quo on these issues just doesn't work anymore. So looking ahead, again, I think it's critical that China join others that want to see some changes in these rules to better reflect and govern the types of trade practices that China and frankly some other countries as well are pursuing in 2021, looking to the future. Now, with respect to your question, where can China and the US and frankly the EU and other major countries, where can we cooperate when we look at this WTO agenda? Where can we collaborate, or where do our interests align? There are some areas. I think number one, fish subsidies is an area where we should be working together. I think it's very important that an agreement be reached on fish subsidies for the WTO's credibility. That's going to almost be the litmus test for MC12. If there's not a fishery subsidies negotiation, then I think the headline's going to be, the WTO can no longer produce negotiated agreements. But I think here we need to have an honest discussion about the special and differential exceptions, but we also need to make sure it's a meaningful agreement, that it doesn't just lock in the status quo. We should all be taking on obligations which actually address a real problem, and that is overfishing and over-subsidization. And this is severe environmental impacts. I think in the area of e-commerce, we have some shared interest. If we put some of the big issues where we have differences, like free flow of data or data localization, there are areas, particularly with respect to trade facilitation and digital trade, where I think we have shared interest, and maybe those are areas where we can work together. On COVID recovery, I know there are differences between our governments, but I also think when you look at just the trade aspects, there are areas where we can work together. The United States now is in support of a TRIPS waiver, but it's a TRIPS waiver for vaccines. I don't think this is the end-all be-all issue for COVID. I think it's just like one part towards a COVID response, but China supports this initiative as well. And I think we could work together with the authors of this initiative to try and limit it and make it workable so we could have a meaningful outcome in this area. And I would finally just put on the table, I think it would be important for the multilateral trading system if the United States and China can find a way to start taking, I would call them baby steps towards lifting some of the tariffs that we have in place against each other's imports. Whether we could just limit that to the medical sector, pick out some environmental products, or just reciprocally lift some tariffs, I think that could be a real shot in the arm for the WTO going forward. Because as we know, we both know the history here, but let's be honest, these tariffs are not helpful for either country. And they're also, they kind of undermine the relevance and the credibility of the World Trade Organization if the two largest economies, have such substantial trade barriers in place between each other's imports.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. I think absolutely at your last statement that is all expected and extremely expected and welcomed by many business community, because lifting the tariff, imposed by Trump administration on China, and also China can lift some of that in response. It would be really a great idea to show that both U.S. and China are supporting the multilateral system, supporting the free trade and the free flow of the goods. So that is absolutely important. I totally agree with you. I think that is really what we need, and also. And on the other issues, I think we probably really need to get coordination of the major trading powers like U.S., China, and the EU. So Pascal, I mean, you are the have been spending so many years at WTO managing that organization, and also, of course, what do you think about this appellate bodies thing? We still haven't got that fixed, and also, of course. I mean, just now Wendy mentioned about this patent. For the COVID-19 to get really lifted, we probably, China and the U.S. agreed that maybe patent can be the intellectual property, probably we won't protect that too much. Could be one of the efforts to solve the issue. And of course, also, I know that EU has proposed the carbon bordering issues on those areas. So perhaps you could elaborate, including the comment that question we raised before. Pascal, please.
Yeah, thanks. Let me touch on a few of these points, while generally very much agreeing with the points which Wendy has made. First, on this issue of China joining WTO, and this will come back when the 20th anniversary will appear on the horizon. As you know, there's now a narrative in the West that accepting China in the WTO was a mistake, and that those who did that, and I rank among them, were stupid enough to be cheated by China. This is absolutely wrong. You yourself, Henry, said, and I totally agree with that, that you just have to look at the numbers. When China joined WTO, its external trade surplus was around 10% of GNP. It's now around 0, maybe 1%. Now, how do you move from 10% of your GNP external surplus to 0 or 1%? There's only one way to do that, which is to import more than you export. And this is what has happened. And this is the answer. China's joining WTO was a big contribution to the world economy. So number-wise, it has worked. That's not the problem. That's not the point. Where there is a problem, which I think we have to recognize looking back 20 years ago when this deal was done, is that the assumption at the time, and I remember my conversations for closing the deal between China and the European Union with Premier Zhu Rongji, who I think is no secret was a reformist. The assumption was that as time would go, long term, China would converge with the dominant global market liberal system. And this is what did not happen, or more precisely, it happened roughly during the first 10 years of China joining WTO, and then in the next 10 years, which are the ones of the last decade, China diverged from this convergence road, which has started with Deng Xiaoping deciding China would rejoin the world economy. And this is where we have a problem. I think the real problem with WTO versus China, or China versus WTO, is that China professes an exceptionalism as compared to global market capitalism, which then creates issues in terms of competition. This is why we need better, more precise rules on what we Europeans call state aid. And we Europeans know this problem. When the common market was created in the 1950s, part of our economies were still more nationalized than others. And the deal that was done at the time, notably between Germany and France had 30% of its economy nationalized, Germany had 5%, and Germany said, okay, I'm okay to open trade with France, but provided we have a system that regulates state aid with a specific body, which was the European Commission, in charge of controlling whether state aids are or not an unfair competitive advantage. So that's where we have an issue. It's not about joining, it's about the fact that 20 years after China joining, China is more of an exception vis-à-vis the rest of the world than it was at the time. As far as the issue of leadership is concerned, which you mentioned, Henry, I totally agree that there is a leadership issue, but that the solution to this leadership issue lies in changing a principle, which is that WTO is member-driven. Member-driven is a reason for poor leadership. Now, not that it should not be member-driven at all. What, in my view, should happen is what happens in other normal international organizations, is a better balance between the authority of the members and the authority of the DG and the Secretariat. This member-driven should be changed to co-driving the organization, members on the one side, they decide, not the DG, not the Secretariat, but the DG and the Secretariat must be given the authority to table proposals, to identify issues, to look into options like any other international organization. This rebalancing is something which is necessary, and I think the WTO would be much more efficient if it was recognized that this member-driven is partially transformed into DG driving. Again, the legislator will remain the member states at the end of the day. On issues looking forward, I agree with what Wendy said about the digital. Of course, with what she said about fishery subsidies, it's only now a question of what are the exceptions in the name that artisanal poor fishermen should not be submitted to these rules. And the question is, what's the border between artisanal and coastal fishing for poor fishermen and big fish, big tuna in the Pacific, big China, big Korea, big Japan? And this is an issue that still needs to be solved. I see environment as a major issue coming. Insofar as, climate change is now the #1 issue of the international agenda globally. This necessitates urgent, bold action that has to translate into implicit or explicit carbon price rise. And this, as long as there will not be a sort of global agreement on a global implicit or explicit carbon price around 100 or 120 euros, which is what economists tell us would be the right price for internalizing the negative effects of production systems in CO2 emissions, there will be different ways to address this problem, depending on countries, constituencies, hence a necessity to adjust these different systems. This is what you mentioned, Henry, why the European Union has now embarked on the CBAM, which is not a new orchestra instrument, contrary to what it sounds, but the carbon border adjustment mechanism in order to avoid that a very high price of carbon in the European Union. I think yesterday the price was 52 euros a ton, which is from far the highest price as compared to US, China, or elsewhere, that this very high price does not lead to carbon leakage, i.e. EU producers moving their production out of the European Union in order to benefit from a lower carbon price. So this is a major issue, and I have proposed in a series of briefs, which I have co-authored with the boss of
Yes.
That would allow countries having different views on how to increase carbon price, whether it's through tax, whether it's through permit emission exchanges, whether it's about regulations, to compare the way they progress in order to smooth the inevitable trade friction that differentiated carbon pricing in different countries will lead. On TRIPS, COVID, I basically agree with what Wendy said. My own view, for what it's worth, is that there are already sanitary exceptions in the TRIPS agreement that provide for compulsory licensing in case of health emergency. We have a clear case of health emergency. What needs to be done is to make sure that the existing compulsory licensing systems work, whereas some view that it doesn't work quick enough. I think it's not a question of overhauling the TRIPS agreement. It's a question of looking at how these exceptions, which are already provided, there are already waivers to intellectual property in the TRIPS agreement in case of health emergency. The question is, do these processes, as they are structured in the TRIPS agreement, allow for quick implementation of these compulsory licensing, whether for domestic production or whether for imports? And finally, on your question about the appellate body, Henry, there is a structural problem and there is a more easy to fix problem. The structural problem takes us back to the issue of whether WTO is able to adjust, to reform, and to adopt new updated rules. As long as the rules remain what they were in the 90s, you have a growing gap between reality and old rules, and inevitably in a dispute settlement system, it belongs to the judge to adjust to this reality. Old rules and new realities can only be reconciled within a dispute settlement system by judges interpreting old rules so that they can match new realities. So the real solution to fix the problem of whether or not the dispute settlement engages in judicial activism is to restart, reboost, rework the rules-making system so that the gap between reality and rules is narrowed. This will leave much less room to judicial activism or pretended judicial activism. On this second part of the problem is probably not that difficult to fix. I believe the US are not always wrong when they say that sometimes some rules of WTO were interpreted in a way that can be criticized. I mean, if the US would say that about cases they won, it would be more convincing than the US saying this only when they lost cases. If you only criticize the judge when you lose cases and never when you win, there's something there which is a bit strange. But let's leave that aside. There are, in my view, many ways to fix these problems if the willingness of the US is to rejoin the dispute settlement system. There are many ways to address these problems. And by the way, the US are not the only country that believes that from time to time, the judges may err in interpreting WTO rules. And this takes me to my final point, which I believe the three of us, Wendy, you and me, can agree, which is that in order to fix this problem, of course, working closely between US, China, and EU is the key. The European Union, to the difference of China and US, is not a full-fledged sovereign, as we all know. Sovereignty about the European Union depends on which topic you consider, but trade is one. Trade is an area where EU has authority, has sovereignty, has size, as well as US and China. And I think this inevitably should lead to fixing a number of these problems within this sort of G3, not that they should decide for others, but if there is a consensus between US, China, and Europe, I would be very surprised if this would not transform quite soon into a WTO consensus. Over to you.
Thank you, Pascal, for your very stimulating and but also forward-looking comments and recommendations. Yeah, I think that first I want to thank both Wendy and Pascal for praise China join WTO, and also think that is the right decision. It's not only for China but also for the world. I think we have a consensus for that. I mean, that is really great. And but also I think that Wendy has mentioned that the China, U.S. China, EU China trade forum, which I think Pascal even took that further. Let's have a China EU US summit on trade. Would be really great. I think that is really the most three strongest trading blocs that really can talk to each other. And if they agree among themselves, I'm sure we'll have an enormous impact on WTO, and that is really very, very good. I just want to maybe clarify one thing. I think, Pascal, you mentioned about that, 20 years ago when China joined WTO, a lot of people think, oh, China, someday you're going to become one of us, you're going to converge, you're going to be a Western democracy and things like that. But you see, China has a 5,000 years history, and it has its own logic, has its own development, rhythm, and DNI, and but just like Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter as a white cat, black cat, and as long as catches mice. And so if China has now really get 1.4 billion people really in kind of improve the livelihood, as you said, at that time the per capita was 1,000, now it's 10,000. That's enormous lifting to the world. So I think maybe we have to look at this coexistence. Maybe find a way to work with each other. I really highly agree with both of you that maybe EU, US, and China should have trilateral talks on the trade, and including for the WTO, and then that will make things much easier. And that is something we need, particularly during the COVID time. We need a high-level dialogue. We need particularly those areas that is such a vital to the world global economy. I think both EU, US, and China can contribute significantly to the stability and prosperity of the world. So I think that is really a great idea out of our discussion tonight. Let's have a G3 summit. I mean, that's really great. Now, I'd like to continue with Wendy, if I may. I know that you are the chief negotiator of TPP for many years. You have really put the TPP into concluded the TPP 12 a number of years back before Trump pulling out of that. But there's a theory that somewhere prevailing before then. So the TPP was designed by the U.S. To contain China and or maybe pivotal to Asia and things like that. But you are the person that you negotiated the TPP, and now China is interested to join the TPP, and now it's called the CPTPP. And then not only China, but the UK and Korea and many other more countries are wanting to join now. So what's your think about the TPP, and also largely those regionalization? We have RCEP, we have a TPP, we have other FTA among the regions. What that going to impact WTO, for example? So maybe you could talk about, share your view on that as well, Wendy, please.
Well, sure. And I would just say, in terms of all of these regional trade agreements or bilateral trade agreements, if the WTO was really actively engaged in rulemaking and delivering successful outcomes on important negotiating topics, I think the appetite for regional and bilateral trade agreements wouldn't be as high as it is now. And so the two are interrelated. I mean, the theory is that if you do bilateral free trade agreements and regional free trade agreements, that those should provide momentum and kind of push the WTO in the direction to do more. And that should contribute to liberalization. I think maybe it's not playing out that way, but in my mind, if within the next year at this ministerial, if the WTO isn't successful in delivering some meaningful outcomes and getting itself back on the map, that you're going to see more and more of trade move toward, to regional and bilateral trade agreements. Now, with respect to TPP, all I can say is that when I worked on it, I would have never predicted we would be in the situation where we are now, where the US is out of TPP. Japan led the other countries to conclude TPP. And now China seems to be more interested in joining CPTPP than the United States. So sometimes my head spins when I think about all of this, but I also think that the story is not over either. Now, it's interesting with respect to TPP in the United States, the debate has not gone away, okay? In fact, some prominent senators and other congressmen, some noted foreign policy types in the administration and others, they've been pretty vocal about seeing the merits of a TPP-like approach and kind of questioning the Trump decisions, the Trump decision for the US to exit the TPP. So the debate continues, and if you carefully look at statements from the administration with respect to TPP, they're almost endorsing the approach of working with like-minded countries to set rules, standards, and norms, while also distancing themselves from the actual contents of what was in the TPP. So I don't think the debate's over in the United States, but I'm also pragmatic and I'm a realist. And I just don't see a scenario in the near term where the Biden administration, given all that's on its plate and given the domestic toxic nature of TPP, that it announces one day we're going to rejoin. I kind of don't see that happening in the near term. I think what's more likely is that the United States works with other like-minded countries in the region to conclude a narrower sectoral type of deal, perhaps in the digital trade area, and perhaps that could build momentum for the United States to to participate in other negotiations in the region. But I'm a firm believer, the United States, we need to get back in the trade space in the region, helping to shape the rules, the norms, and the standards. It's happening without us. We're not benefiting from it. I think in the United States, when Trump left TPP, I think the feeling was that TPP then, would die a quiet death, and also that RCEP would not proceed. And clearly the opposites happened. CPTPP is in effect. The UK now is formally in accession negotiations. And RCEP, I think, will come into effect early 2022. And I think that's going to have a real impact on trade and supply chain and economic integration in the region. So it's time for the United States to get back into the trade game in the Asia-Pacific region. But this doesn't preclude our ability also to engage and lead in the WTO. Again, the Biden administration has a lot on its plate, particularly with respect to COVID, economic recovery, infrastructure, competitiveness. But if we lose the opportunity to engage on trade in the region, it's something I think we might look back on as being a major mistake, and something that when we're ready to come back, it will be such a different Asia, and our ability to be a real player and to influence the rules, norms, and standards will be minimized.
Okay, thank you, Wendy, for your comment on that. And I agree that U.S. needs to be back on more on those regional trade, even digital. It's better than not coming back. So, Pascal, I mean, you used to be the European Commissioner for Trade as well. I mean, you know that recently China and the EU, I mean, last year, at the end of last year, China and the EU have signed this comprehensive investment treaty between the two parties. And somehow, this has been slowed down again. But actually, the European business is still very bullish in China. We have seen the numbers, surveys coming from EU Chamber of Commerce. We see actually European investment in China is increasing. We see that all the auto sector or maybe pharmaceutical sector or even in aerospace, they do more business in China than their own countries now. So what do you see the prospect of China-EU business? I mean, that is really great. Also, another question I want to pose to you is you are the president of Paris Peace Forum, and the Paris Peace Forum is really a great multilateral global governance platform, and now you have been spending a lot of efforts on that. But I see you actually leading a lot of discussion with WTO Director General, WHO Director General, quite a few rounds on that already. So what do you think about the Paris Peace Forum can promote the future globalization, in those areas? Pascal, please.
I'll answer these questions. Let me come back 1 minute to the point you made about China as a different system.
Okay.
And to say that I agree with that. I agree that those who thought 20 years ago that China would converge with the dominant system in the world, at least economically, let's leave aside the political regime, were not right. So the name of the game is not about convergence anymore, it's about coexistence. This is what we have to do. We have to better organize the coexistence of a specific China with the rest of the system. It's not about regime change. It's not about the rest of the world telling China, change your doctrine, shrink your state-owned sector, because a state-owned sector is not good for China, which personally I believe, but that's for the Chinese to decide. So whatever decision the Chinese leadership and people take on how they organize their economy, this is their business. But once the Chinese sovereignly decide they want to have 30% of their economy under state control, because these companies have to be supported by the state, then you need to accept that others do not proceed the same way, and that there has to be disciplines on state aids. So again, it's not about telling China how it should run this business. Once China decides it has a massive part of its economy under party and state control, this is a competitive disadvantage for others, which needs to be fixed. So it's not a political issue, it's an issue of you run your economy the way you want to run it, but this should not put the others at a comparative disadvantage, hence the importance of this competitive neutrality, whether on the Chinese domestic market or when others compete with Chinese businesses in international markets. On TPP, I very much agree that the TPP is the best in class for the moment. If you look at what is the most modern way to address both what I called protectionism and precautionism, including all these trade and environment, trade and health, trade and safety, trade and so on, the TPP is the best benchmark on the market. The paradox being that it's a creation of the US. The whole software of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a US software that coincides with the way the US see the world, with the way the EU see manufacturing, services, intellectual property. It's incredibly US-minded, and Australia and New Zealand and Japan and others have accepted that. And the paradox is that this incredibly US-minded, very good agreement, the US are not part of it. That's a sort of mystery of history, which historians will probably comment 50 or 60 years from now, I think that the way forward is probably that you should do with TPP what we are doing with WTO, i.e. move away from the single undertaking and accept that TPP is with bits and pieces, and that some of these bits and pieces can be joined either by the US or by China or by UK, why not? And I think this is the pragmatic way to go. But it remains that it is a lead agreement, especially, by the way, if you compare it to RCEP. RCEP is very much a sort of old-style agreement that deals mostly with manufacturers, tariffs, and quantitative restrictions. It's a large agreement, and hence its importance, but it's much shallower in terms of discipline on how you run your economy in order to benefit from open trade than the TPP. As far as the EU-China investment agreement, I remember what was signed at the end of last year between US and China was not a trade agreement. It was an investment agreement that basically allowed the EU to catch up on what the US had gotten from China in terms of openness for investing in China. You're absolutely right. For the moment, this will not be ratified by the European Parliament because of sanctions and retaliations on sanctions about Uyghurs, Hong Kong, and so on. Again, on this, let's be pragmatic. Nothing prevents both China and the EU to effectively implement this agreement without this agreement being ratified. If we are serious about the fact that there are benefits on both sides, it will not be ratified, so it will not be legally binding as a treaty should be legally binding, but nothing prevents both sides to move in reality towards the content of this agreement. And this, I think, this is, the way to go. On your last question about the Paris Peace Forum, Henry, the Paris Peace Forum, of course, is not a trade forum, and it's probably not fit to be a trade forum because, the Paris Peace Forum is about getting things done. It's about getting projects done. It's about moving global cooperation into new areas by new stakeholders, whereas a multilateral trading system is still something that has to do a lot with regulation. And the Paris Peace Forum is about cooperation between non-state driven, non-sovereign partners like NGOs, like big businesses, like big academic institutions, like big cities, whereas trade is still regulated by sovereigns. So this is not where we have, as a Paris Peace Forum, a big comparative advantage, but what we can do is mix like what we do in order to try and address this looming, if not already there, vaccine apartheid between North and South on this planet, which I personally believe is a dramatic development that will slow the exit of this economic crisis stemming from a sanitary crisis for 1 or 2 more years, which I believe is a dramatic development. And what we are trying together, as you said, Henry, with the World Bank, with the IMF, who's taking a leading role in trying to address this issue of a better North-South production and distribution of vaccines, including, of course, with WTO and WHO. This sort of 4 people, David Malpass, and Kristalina Georgieva, Ngozi, and Dr. Tedros, are the ones we are trying within the Paris Peace Forum to push to cooperate, including in trying to get from the next G20 commitments about more production and more distribution of existing non-use vaccines, which I believe is really, really, really a major issue, which we have to address extremely rapidly, short of which I believe a source of new north-south fracture will divide this world, and we will see the consequences of that in major negotiations like the one who are being prepared for Glasgow on climate change, for instance. So I think this is a big, big, big problem. Not that our trade issues are not important, but for the moment, there is something more important, which is this vaccine production and distribution, which is a major economic issue. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pascal. Yes, great. I really congratulate you on the leadership of the Paris Peace Forum, which you have such a great rally power, and of course with WHO, WTO, and World Bank, IMF. You already had quite a few webinars I attended, but I think maybe you could add AIB in the future to other infrastructure part of that, because infrastructure would be a new area that I see President Biden is paying a lot of attention, EU is paying attention, China is really also doing a lot of work. So that could be one of the things. I don't know if a WTO or maybe other, World Bank can, AIB can work together. But I agree with you that the TPP. I mean, I'm quite pleased to see both Wendy and Pascal has actually have a high credit for TPP as a higher standards of the future trade. Upper trade, high standard trade for the global trade in future, and maybe set a good example for the WTO reform. So even we put part of a piece of that, that'd be great. So I'm glad that the CCG also been promoting China joint TPP, because I feel that maybe it's like a mini WTO we can join, because since China joined WTO, China abolished thousands or tens of thousands of outdated rules and regulations that made China, going forward. So we need some new target to hope to aim for, so that TPP could be a good high standard for our reform as well. Now I won't have a last round of my talk. We collect some questions from our experts and media as well. But before we do that, I would like to pose another question to Wendy, is that on the Sino-US trade relation, that of course you've been waiting this. We've been also talking in the 2018, 2019 when on the hike of US-China trade war going on, and then of course President Trump has put such a large tariff on China. I mean, still 300 some billion there, not lifted. So what do you think about the phase one, and then if there's a phase two, or is there a near future that we can really get our talks to lift those trade sanctions? Because I see the USTR, Catherine Tai has made a phone call with Vice Premier Liu He, and the Minister of Trade also has Commerce has a phone call as well. So what do you think about I see there's an Alaska meeting between the top diplomats, the Tianjin meeting last week between diplomats. What about we have a trade minister meeting or commerce minister meeting or USTR meeting to solve these trade sanction issues that, as you also mentioned, particularly on the medical, some urgent supply issues. We shouldn't leave levy tax on both sides. We should really support on that, and maybe have some new incentive for the WTO minister meetings for that. What do you think? And what are your comments about Sino-US trade relation? Wendy, please.
I think that could be subject to its own webinar, but just a few thoughts here. It's interesting, during the Trump administration, I think US-China trade friction kind of, was front and center in our overall relationship. And in the Biden administration, trade is part of a whole host of issues that are being reviewed internally. So the Biden administration is still undertaking its review. We don't know where they're going to come out on tariffs and sanctions and phase 1 agreement and the phase 2 issues. So we'll have to see how that transpires. My personal view, though, is we should find a way to, again, maybe with respect to tariffs, to find some baby steps we could take, meaning just, as you mentioned, I think the United States now, we have over $300 billion worth of tariffs in place against Chinese imports. China has $110 billion worth of tariffs imposed on US imports. So I think there is room for kind of small steps to be taken, and then we can see, does that work, and maybe then build on it over time. But I think we need to be realistic and pragmatic. Both sides have their own domestic audiences that we're responding to. This would happen, let's be honest, in a not in a vacuum, but in the context of just broader US-Sino frictions and tensions. So that would be number one on the tariffs. With respect to phase 1 implementation, my personal view is, under the circumstances, China's doing a pretty good job in implementing the rules part of the agreement. When it comes to purchases, yeah, they're falling short, but with respect to agriculture purchases, they're probably doing, Beijing's doing the best in meeting those targets. Those detailed targets will expire at the end of this year, but the agreement itself stays in place until either side notifies the other it wants to exit. But what will be critical is when we look at these so-called phase 2 issues, which were never addressed, the phase 2 negotiations never started. I think the question is how best to address those issues. And some of them, particularly the issue of subsidies and related kind of non-market economy practices, I think the best venue, if the WTO really worked well to address these, would be the WTO. We're not going to address these issues, in my view, bilaterally successfully, and it'd be important to bring in other countries. So I would hope that China would be positive about addressing these issues in negotiations in the WTO. If the Chinese delegations in Geneva continue to refuse to open the door to negotiations in these areas, the US and other countries are going to have no choice then but to look at alternatives. And the alternatives, I think, will be what I would call defensive measures, strengthening their own toolbox. We've already seen the EU do this recently on subsidies and competition policy. There's legislation in the United States to strengthen and expand our countervailing duty legislation. And so I think that is going to be the response if the WTO can't move forward and tackle some of these difficult issues.
Okay, thank you. I think that that's something I think we all need to talk, and I'm glad to see that the phase 1 probably went relatively well, and also that I totally agree with you. We should start lifting some of those tariffs imposed on each other, and then we can really move from there and maybe even remove most of it or even completely. So we need to talk. We need to start somewhere. Absolutely. Now, Pascal, I mean, you are in the EU. You're in the center. You're in Paris. You have been in all those issues. I noticed the OECD. I mean, lately proposed there's a global corporate minimum tax, and then that has actually proposed by G7, and then proposed by G20, and then 130 countries. Goes along with it. In principle, China is agreed to on that, and so that is one issue. And also about this digital tax. I mean, used to the EU used to asking for those big tech companies. So what about those issues? I don't know if you're still on top of those issues. Maybe you can share on that of the EU perspective on that as well.
No, I think I mean these are the area of global taxation for multinational companies is one of the very rare good news we've had for the last years in terms of international cooperation, which, sorry, generally speaking, has been pretty immobile. there are very, very few issues where we can see progress in international cooperation. This is one, and we owe it mostly to the Biden administration. These issues about avoiding multinational corporations to practice what diplomats kindly define as excessive tax harmonization, and I love this way they have of calling this excessive tax optimization. I think this is an area where we've had progress. We owe it mostly to the Biden administration, and this is good news. And it simply stems from the fact that the importance and the growth of these multinational companies, including in the digital sector, where they are making hundreds and hundreds of billions of profit without paying taxes, is something that has become unsustainable for political reasons everywhere. But to be frank, Henry, this is an exception. And we need much more than that, especially in trying to move out of this COVID crisis. We need much more than that to re-dynamize international cooperation. I think the G20 is the available space to do that, not that it is a full-fledged institution, not that the G20 members have the legitimacy to speak for the rest of the world, but this is the place where I think we should focus our minds, including, by the way, and on this I very much agree, to translate into general terms what Wendy has just said about fixing the US-China trade frictions and tariffs. I think the most urgent thing is to try and devise for the next Italian G20, apart from what I've said on vaccines, a few low-hanging fruit that would not be too difficult to address, and that would signal a relaunch of international negotiations and cooperation on trade. I think what we need for the moment is to defreeze this US-China EU triangle in order to move things forward. And I agree with Wendy that the most obvious area to do that, which is not a major trade problem, but which has become a symbol of whether WTO can decide and move forward, is this fishery subsidies, which is a low-hanging, if not fruit, fish, at least fruit, which I think we really should focus on. And on this, to be frank, we need China to engage. China, fishing-wise, is not anymore a developing country. I know that for reasons and principles, China will not recognize this. And this is not about China recognizing a big principle. It's about China accepting to join a system of disciplines, which I think is really needed to preserve the fish resources for the future. And it's as much an environment as a trade problem. So if China still has trade problems with the West, please, China, look at this with environmental glasses.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. I think that you talk about China as a developing country. China actually, the per capita wise, still pretty relatively low compared with all the developing countries, or developed countries. But as a matter of fact, China, even though they are, because they are in line with many developing countries, they didn't really enjoy the developing country benefit in terms of the WTO. So they have foregone a lot of that benefit already. So I think that is something that maybe term-wise, we can think about that. But I don't think it was really a substance issue there probably. But anyway, we are coming to the final online question part. We're going to conclude probably soon. But as a matter of fact, my staff told me we have about almost 400,000 viewers watching us online, and those in China and outside. And so you're really getting a lot of attention. I have some online question collected. Actually, I have a question from Professor Tu Xinquan. He's a CCG non-resident senior fellow, and he's the Dean and Professor of China Institute for WTO Studies at the University of International Business and Economics. He has a question. He said, we expect the Biden administration, which pays more attention to the multilateral system, would support the restoration of the operation of the WTO appellate body. However, a little difference has been seen in the attitudes of the Biden administration compared with the Trump era. Is the US going to completely abolish the appellate body, or is it using as a leverage to obtain specific policy objectives such as more free use of anti-dumping and countervailing rules? So he has another question related with the fishery discussions. He said hopes are high on negotiating on the fishery subsidies at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. But that said, the US recently proposed to add the issue of forced labor in the negotiations. Does this signal the US intention of making more difficult of the success negotiation, or use it as a concession to obtain concession from other countries? So that's from Professor Tu. But I also have some question from the media, like from the China Daily. What is the biggest challenge for international trade in the context of COVID-19? How should we, tackle that? And also from CPPCC Daily, China's Political Consultative Conference Daily. Recently, the executive meeting of the State Council of China has decided to further deepen the reform of the cross-border trade facilitation and improve the business environment at ports. Those measures mainly included 27 specific content in the 5 aspects. So would this be positive signs of China actually moving forwards to the multilateral system? One thing has been highlighted, that is we need to optimize the authorized economic operator system and provide more facilitation measures for authorized enterprise. How to evaluate this, what this means to further strengthen hand. Anyway, maybe this is too concrete question, but then there's another one from South China Morning Post. I think similar to what Professor Tu was saying. The fishery subsidy issue is currently the sole active area of the multilateral negotiation at the WTO. How possible do you expect that a WTO fishery pact can be reached by the end of the year? What are the stumbling blocks and how to deal with them? Whether the US-China tension remains a key factor for the talks. So I think we probably have last few questions for you to see if we want to address any of them, and maybe we'll conclude after that. So maybe Wendy, you want to go first?
Sure, it's a lot of questions. So let me respond to a few. First, with respect to the appellate body, I think you need to give the administration more time here. They're clearly reviewing, the issues related to dispute settlement in the WTO. I would also note that the appellate body issue was an issue of concern even before President Trump took office. And I would just echo what Pascal Lamy said a little while ago, that this is not just a US concern, that other countries are concerned with the operation and the overreach of the appellate body. So I think we need to give the administration more time. My hope is that with time, they will put concrete ideas on the table on how their concerns can be addressed, as opposed to what officials in the Trump administration did, was just to kind of sit on the sidelines and kind of complain about the system. So again, let's give it more time. With respect to trade and COVID, one issue we have not covered, and I just want to put it on the table, is the whole issue of export restrictions really needs to be looked at. The WTO rightly allows for export restrictions to be imposed, but there are certain principles, including these measures should be temporary and they should be transparent. And if you look at the recent study coming out of St. Gallen University, they closely catalog all the restrictions that are put on medical related goods, medicines, as well as food. And I think they noted like hundreds of measures now have been in place for over 1 year. So I think that is an area where more discussion and kind of more focus, more transparency should be put on to make sure once these restrictions are put in place, that they don't remain in place forever. Finally, on the fisheries negotiations, I'm hopeful that that will be a concrete outcome of the ministerial meeting in November. But this is not a given. There's a lot of work still to be done. While a lot of progress has been made, there are still some potential stumbling blocks. And those include exceptions that developing countries, including China, want to take from the obligations. And so the WTO is in a summer break now. They'll have 3 months to continue negotiations in this area. And I'm hopeful, given the high stakes of reaching an agreement here, that parties will come together and find not just a solution, but a meaningful solution that really contributes to what is a growing global problem.
Okay, thank you. Pascal, please, your final comment.
Yeah, on international trade and COVID-19, as I said previously, I don't think it's a major trade problem, nor do I believe that the solution to producing more vaccines and distributing them better is a trade issue, but for a limited aspect, which is whether and how you can oil the compulsory licensing system that already provides waivers for intellectual property in case of health emergency. So it's not a major trade issue, but there is an issue there that needs to be considered. I do not agree that the main bottleneck to producing or distributing more vaccines lies there, although I believe that if there is a necessity to recourse more easily to the existing system of compulsory licensing, this should be looked at. On measures for trade facilitation, imports or otherwise, I think China is right. There still remains, although we have a trade facilitation agreement since the end of 2013, and I remember that because it took us 4 years to cook it in the WTO at the time, whereas there are obvious huge potential for trade facilitation in digitalization of trade procedures, imports, export certificates, import licensing, proof of origin. The digital technology can help a lot. There still is a handicap for notably small businesses. And I think in doing what China does, in easing its port handling procedures, it's doing exactly right. And finally, on fish subsidies, I again totally agree with Wendy. The answer to the question which was raised, which is what stands on the way to an agreement, I think the simple answer is the following. We need stronger disciplines that prevent subsidies that lead to overfishing, but we need to preserve small artisanal coastal fishing operations. That's the key. Now, in simple words, we need disciplines for everybody, but for small fishing boats, artisanal, not industrial, coastal, not high sea, small, not big boats. Now, how small is small remains to be negotiated. But I think if there is a political willingness to do an agreement, how small is something which trade negotiators can fix rather easily. So that's my view. That's where the problem lies. And this is where, in my view, the solution lies. There is a solution in defining how small is small. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Prosper. I think we almost come to the end of our webinar, a special webinar series for the 7th Center for China and Globalization Forum. I really appreciate the discussion tonight. I think it's very stimulating, very constructive, and also very full of a lot of ideas and suggestions. And also, I think that we have covered many issues: WTO reform, COVID-19, the future multilateralism, even concrete as a TPP, fishery subsidy, and Paris Peace Forum. Of course, we have so many issues. But I think this is really great. I mean, this is an open dialogue we have. It's really a frank discussion, and also it's very good to stimulating more thoughts. I really appreciate that. We have come to some kind of consensus that maybe we should really lift some of those tariffs, even from very minimum. But I'm very grateful that, of course, also we had this we should have a China join WTO is a good thing. I mean, at least we have a consensus. Of course, we still need to make progress. We need to still to make reform. But China join the WTO, not only good for China but also for the world. I think that is another consensus we have. But also, finally, I really appreciate. All three of us mentioned about U.S., EU, China. Let's have a trilateral summit of some kind. Be on the trade. I mean, honestly, that probably even on COVID-19 fighting as well. It would be a really great idea to do that. I really hope that we have offered policymakers some interesting alternatives as well. So once again, I want to thank Ms. Wendy Cutler, Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute. But also former acting USTR and chief negotiator of TPP, and also to Mr. Pascalami, the president of Paris Peace Forum, but also the former WTO Director General for one of the longest serving DJ, and also former European Commissioner for Trade as well. So, and also to our viewers, I mean, we have almost 400,000 viewers online, and that's spectacular across China and the rest of the world. So once again, thank you all very much, and we hope to see you again sometime later. So thank you.